All right, now we're live. So now it's working. Okay, so some of the questions you've been answering: peripherin, stationary, they're sessile, they're filter feeders, they have an osculum. Same thing with the cnidarians. That of they produce venom, they got tentacles. All these characteristics, if you keep reminding yourself and you keep listening to that when we're starting these days off, like I said, it's going to be a lot easier for you when we get towards that final. Okay, so with the mollusks, then you already said they have a shell. That is one characteristic that these all have in common. Okay. Now, we are not to terrestrial animals yet. Only just a couple, very few. Your snails, those are terrestrial, but they're tied to water. And for the most part, most mollusks, I think you would agree, are all aquatic yet. So when that happens, you still have these structures. And inside this mantle cavity, you're not just going to have the gills, you're going to have organs of digestion and organs of circulation. Now, we only talked about this in open circulatory system, okay, as opposed to a closed type. We just made an example. What would the difference be between a closed? Is that pressurized or not pressurized? Which do you think? It is pressurized. So just like, for instance, this has just always been an opinion of mine when it came to parking different types of equipment that have hydraulics attached to them. How many of you, you have a loader tractor, for instance, it's got the bucket on there, you pull it in your shed, and you leave it this high up off the ground? I would agree. I think that's right. Not everyone does that, though. But why is it that you don't want, well, this is just our opinion. Everyone can say, well, that's not how we do things. But why do we, if we agree upon that, sounds like we do, why would you not have that up off the ground? The cylinders, but more particularly these little guys, which are what? What letter is this? Yeah, O-rings in there, okay? So those seals, when you leave that up here, it's putting pressure on them O-ring seals, okay? So when you say you put it in float, you're relieving all that and letting it set on the ground, okay? So that means that's a pressurized system, because one of the things that can happen is if you do leave it up like this eventually and you come out next day and it's on the ground anyway, that's an indication that you have a hydraulic leak. That's what my opinion would be upon that. So that is a pressurized system. The circulation of these animals is an open type. In other words, it just flows to an open area. We're talking about if you have a headache behind your eyes, what do we call that? You might call it what type? Yeah, a sinus headache. A sinus is just an open cavity or an open area. In this case, you have all of those organs of digestion, respiration, circulation, all found in this mantle cavity. And it does provide that type of a protective function. Now, one of the reasons, but what you can hopefully think about is you have a type of connective tissue that holds your intestines in place. Should something like this happen to where you're lifting something that's too heavy or put too much pressure in this area, your intestines can poke out through some of that connective tissue, and it can get knotted in there. And if that happens, it's not that you're in big trouble, but you better have that seen pretty quick, because if your intestines become blocked, toxins are probably going to start building up inside of there. But has anyone ever heard of a hernia? You probably have. And that's kind of a vague term. You can have a herniated disc, you can have a hernia in your abdomen. Any one of those is going to be a rupture of either some sort of connective tissue. Okay? So kind of like your what's called your omentum holds your intestines in place, you have this mantle that holds your organs of digestion, respiration, circulation. Does a protective function, holds them in one place then. Okay? So, all these animals have a shell. All of these animals have a radula. That is a second unique characteristic of this phylum. Anybody get hit in the fingers Friday night at all? Even stings? That's probably a rhetorical question. Yeah, that's going to sting. Probably thump and hurt. And maybe if you get caught up between two face masks, something like that. I'm just guessing that. Check out what? Doesn't look like it. If he can do this, which looks like he can, and do this. I would say not. Well, looking at that ain't going to make time go faster. Oh. Only if the hands turn into feet, right? Maybe never heard that before. Hands turn into feet. You just kind of jog along rather than drag along. Okay, fair enough. But one of the things, okay, whether it is, and I was unaware of this, when you see a pet that just has had surgery, I had to think about how I was going to state that. You might see what over their head. I have a cone over that. It was always my interpretation. I thought that was to keep them from scratching their ears, but that's not the case. That's probably possible. But does anyone possibly know the real reason that they put a cone over these animals' heads? Okay. I think you're all saying about the same thing, which is correct. You were first, but what you had said is what? Yeah, because and I'd never even heard of that before. When we had one of our dogs on the farm, take him to the vet, okay, okay, when his surgery was done, bring him home, we didn't have a cone on his head, okay, and I don't think that anything ever happened from that, but so what is it that you think? It's actually their tongue, okay, licking that can pull those stitches out. That's true. So it's kind of like a rudimentary form of this, okay? So mammals like cats and dogs, okay, they don't have these tiny teeth, but they might have something similar to that. And we have them as well. And if you roll your tongue, you can feel them. What are those by chance? No. Go say it again. How does our central computer, this guy, how does it determine whether something is bitter, sour, salty, sweet? Taste buds. Where are those located? On your tongue. That's right. So when we're talking about some of these dogs that can lick their stitches out, it's these taste buds that actually can start working on them and pull them out. So that's a similar function, or excuse me, a similar structure, but a totally different function. Okay? So, but how many of you knew that before? Because I'm saying that's a recent, I wouldn't say innovation, but he said I always thought it was just keep them from scratching their heads. But yeah, so they don't lick their stitches. Did anyone ever have to take them cones off and put it back on again? It's awful. There's once you get it snapped in, maybe it's just you just leave it. Uh, Poor animal. How many of you hated to put one of them? How many of you have done that though? Put a cone on it. Okay, and oh, I didn't like doing that either. But I think you would agree those decisions are made for the benefit of the animal, right? So, and I hope, and I think you would agree that decisions are made here in this school that hopefully are for the benefit. You might not think so at the time, but are made for the benefit of your future. Okay. Now, I'm not totally positive. I think I came across a pail that was labeled clams. If they're in there, we'll possibly take a look at them later on this week. So you get somewhat of an idea of what some of these interior or internal structures actually look like. Because it's just my guess for some people, when you see that, if you've always had oyster stew, some of you have already said, I will not eat that. This probably is going to reinforce that. It's probably not going to help the case. So we're trying not to tarnish that impression of whether you may or may not like that, but this is what you're actually consuming when you're having that oyster stew coming out of the clams there. Probably a secondary function of these muscles, and for any type of muscle, whether it's a mammal, a bird, a reptile, human, any one of those, okay, its primary function is going to be movement. Well, we've already established that here. Locomotion, that's going to be a type of movement, okay? But muscles can also have a secondary function. We usually associate that, yes, it is true, your skeletal system does provide certain protection, but so do your muscles too, of underlying tissues as well. The bulk of your body is actually made of muscle, okay? So with that, your primary function is this. But if the system is not pressurized, which this isn't, this open circulatory system, blood is flowing into these muscles and it just stays there. Okay? So you have this heart that's actually pumping nutrients, oxygen throughout the body. It pools in an area and it's just going to stay there until that muscle contracts again. Okay? So one of the things that, for those of you who have been in here for the biology class that we have, one of the segments that we had seen is what was called athletic body limits is what it was called. And they were interviewing two different two different rock climbers. And it's one of those to where this young lady was comparing herself to someone. Oh, this brute guy thinks he's going to pass me up in rock climbing, and in certain cases probably can and maybe does. But why would women be better rock climbers than men? True, but think of what is it that provides us energy in our bodies. Well, but when you're doing one of these things and climbing up there, if you have really big muscles, and when you bring that back down or when they contract like this, you can actually feel that. When those muscles are contracting, what's it doing to them blood vessels? Say that again. Because I know what you're saying, but you got this over your head. Does what? Yeah, it cuts them off. So those muscles are not getting those vital nutrients and oxygen. So what happens is, I don't think it's so much this stage of the game when you're lifting weights, but maybe at the beginning of the year or beginning of the season, but especially in your legs. Does anyone know why are your legs so darn sore? And maybe they're not, which would be good too. I know you're running, that's true. But if you remember anything from biology, okay, when it comes to cellular respiration, okay, if you're producing energy anaerobically, which the body does, that means it's producing it without oxygen. But if you're starving these muscles of that very oxygen, you're producing energy with the buildup of lactic acid. And that's why your muscles tend to get sore. So what happens, you start chugging the water, and that starts to flush that out of your system. It's going to take time. It's not going to be glug, 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 glug. Oh, yep, we're good. It's not. Body just doesn't work that way. You take that water in, and again, it'll flush that out of the system. But in this case, when you have this blood with all the nutrients that pools in an area, it's just going to stay there. But once that muscle contracts again, it pushes it back into the bloodstream. Now, do these animals have to worry about breathing oxygen, do you think? And the answer to that would be, look at this previous slide. Two slides. Because they don't breathe like we do. They absorb the oxygen similar through diffusion, but in this case, you're always going to have that happen as long as water is flowing over these structures. Okay? So, finally, let's see here. We wanted to do, start talking about the clamp. We got 1, 2, okay. So we'll go ahead and introduce, there's 3 layers, okay? And I don't know the best way to, okay. Now whether you did that alphabetically, I don't know, trying to keep these 2 separate. Obviously you can't go by the 2 P's, but then the E you could. Or just associate that with calcium carbonate. I don't know what works best for yourselves to keep them 2 separate. And if you look at a side view of these clams, I'm not mistaken, you can kind of see these 2 different types of layers. And then that Narcissus layer, that would be, looks like little waves inside of that shell. Okay? So again, the major function of that shell is always going to be protection, which is true. And it's going to be a unifying characteristic of this phylum, is having a shell. Now, what other types of animals are in this phylum that you would just not think, well, they don't have a shell because you can't see it? Okay? Well, it's something that you don't have to see to know that it's there. Well, of course, the most common example you'd give is oxygen. No one's going to argue with that. Can't see it until it gets cold outside and you exhale, but that's not oxygen. That's water vapor. That's freezing. But we certainly know that oxygen's there. Can't see it. But so what type of mollusk has a shell, but you just can't see it? And if you think of, just give some examples. We know snails do. We know slugs do. We already know that clams do because you can see them. And we know that nautili or nautilus have a shell because you can see that. but what might be a couple cousins of theirs close? That's something that they might prey upon, though. It could be a giant one. What type of animal do you know that has the word giant in it? So think aquatic, something you find in the ocean. Do, do, do. It has to be an invertebrate, so it's not any type of fish. A giant squid. That's right. Okay? So when you picture a squid, can you see the shell on that? No, you cannot. So does anyone want to take a guess where that shell is actually located? Obviously on the inside, but it's a structure called the pen. And what that pen does is, if this was you have to use your imagination here, I get that, but if this was your squid right here, the pen is actually on the inside. It's one of the aspects to where it's a type of connective tissue that connects ganglia. So when we say ganglia, that means it's a type of neuronal tissue. It's not any type of brain structure yet, at least not in squids. Now in octopods, that's a little different. Okay, they're going to have a bigger cranial cavity. You're going to have a bigger shell. Now that I would be led to believe actually has a brain, because octopods are pretty highly intelligent. They establish different types of behavior that are really not known to the rest of the phylum, but that's neither here nor there. So we will continue with talking about this shell tomorrow, and then some of the internal structures that will associate with that of the mollusks, and then we'll get on to the gastropods. So we'll catch up to you next time.